March 9th, 1945, 23,000 feet above the Pacific. The air is thin and cold, biting through every seam of the aircraft's aluminum skin. Inside the fuselage of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the oxygen is stale, recycled through masks that fog with each breath. The crew can feel the vibration of 4 Wright R-3350 engines humming in synchronized fury, each one a masterpiece of American engineering, each one turning massive propellers that drag this silver giant through hostile skies. Below them, an endless gray ocean swallows the horizon. Ahead, somewhere beyond the clouds and the curvature of the Earth, lies Tokyo. The men are silent, locked into their routines. The bombardier rechecks his Norden bomb sight for the 3rd time. The navigator traces his pencil along a map that has been folded and unfolded so many times the creases have worn white. The pilot, a 24-year-old captain from Nebraska, keeps his hands steady on the yoke, his eyes scanning the instrument panel in a practiced rhythm. Altitude, airspeed, fuel, engine temperature. Everything is nominal. Everything is as it should be. For now. They do not know yet that in less than 2 hours, 3 of those 4 engines will be dead. They do not know that Japanese fighter pilots, scrambling from airfields across the Kanto Plain, will look up at their crippled aircraft and assume it is already a ghost, a falling coffin waiting to meet the sea. They do not know that they will complete their mission anyway, but history will remember. By the spring of 1945, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress had become the instrument of America's aerial doctrine in the Pacific theater. It was not merely an airplane, it was a statement. With a wingspan of over 140 feet, a pressurized cabin that allowed crews to operate at altitudes beyond the reach of most Japanese interceptors, and a payload capacity exceeding 10,000 pounds of high explosive or incendiary ordnance, the B-29 represented the intersection of industrial might and strategic vision. It was designed to do what no other bomber in the world could do: carry the war directly to the Japanese mainland, across thousands of miles of ocean, and return home. The Japanese High Command knew this. They had watched the first B-29 raids in the summer of 1944, launched from bases in China and later from the newly captured Mariana Islands. They had seen the smoke rising from steel mills and aircraft factories. They had felt the tremors as American bombs walked through urban districts, turning wood and paper neighborhoods into ash. The B-29 was not an enemy they could meet on equal terms. It flew higher, farther, and with more precision than anything in their arsenal. And so, when Japanese pilots did encounter these silver giants, they attacked with a desperation born of knowing they were already losing. But desperation breeds assumptions, and assumptions can be deadly. The Japanese fighter pilots who trained in the final year of the war were taught to respect the B-29, but also to exploit its vulnerabilities. They knew the bomber relied on all 4 engines to maintain altitude and speed over long distances. Knock out one engine, and the aircraft became sluggish, vulnerable. Knock out 2, and it would likely abort the mission, jettison its bombs over empty ocean, and limp back to base. Knock out 3? 3 was impossible. A B-29 with 3 dead engines was a falling anvil. It could not maintain altitude, it could not maneuver, it could not fight, it certainly could not bomb Tokyo. This was the doctrine. This was the reality they had been taught. On March 9th, 1945, they would discover that American engineering had rewritten that reality. The first engine failed at 8:47 hours. Number 3, the starboard inboard engine. A sudden shudder rippled through the airframe, followed by a grinding whine that every man aboard felt in his chest. The flight engineer's eyes snapped to the instrument panel. Oil pressure dropping, temperature spiking, the propeller was windmilling, useless, dragging against the slipstream like an anchor. The pilot did not hesitate. He reached for the feathering switch, locking the propeller blades edge on to the wind, minimizing drag. The co-pilot adjusted the throttle on the remaining 3 engines, compensating for the loss of power. The aircraft dipped slightly, then leveled. They were still flying. They were still on course. The crew exchanged glances. One engine down was manageable. It was not ideal, but it was manageable. They had trained for this. The mission would continue. 18 minutes later, the second engine failed. Number 4, the outboard starboard engine. This time, there was no warning. Just a violent bang, a belch of black smoke, and the sudden asymmetry of thrust that tried to yaw the aircraft hard to the right. The pilot fought the yoke, his muscles straining, while the co-pilot worked the rudder pedals, countering the torque. The flight engineer killed the fuel flow, feathered the propeller, and watched the starboard wing sag under the weight of 2 dead engines. The navigator did not look up from his charts. He had already calculated the math. 2 engines down, increased drag, reduced airspeed. They could still make it to Tokyo, barely, but they would not make it back. The pilot keyed the intercom. His voice was calm, flat, professional. "We're going in. We finish the mission. Then we ditch in the ocean and hope the Navy picks us up." No one argued. They had come too far. But the Japanese did not know this. From the ground, from the scattered airfields and observation posts that ringed Tokyo, they watched the lone B-29 approach. It was flying lower than usual, slower than usual, trailing a faint haze of vapor from its struggling engines. Fighter pilots scrambled. Anti-aircraft batteries swiveled their barrels toward the sky. This was not a formation. This was a single bomber, wounded, isolated, an easy target, a gift. 3 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters climbed to intercept. They were piloted by men who had survived months of brutal attrition, who had seen their squadrons whittled down by American guns and American numbers. They were hungry for a kill. They closed the distance, positioning themselves in a staggered line astern, preparing for a coordinated attack on the B-29's vulnerable tail section. And then the third engine failed. Number 2, the inboard port engine, the one opposite the first failure. The bomber lurched, yawing wildly as the remaining engine, number 1, the outboard port engine, screamed at maximum throttle, trying to shoulder the entire burden of keeping 70 tons of aluminum and steel and human will aloft. The Japanese pilots saw it happen. They saw the smoke. They saw the asymmetry. They saw a B-29 flying on a single engine. It was impossible. They hesitated, not out of mercy, but out of disbelief. A B-29 could not fly on one engine. It defied physics. It defied everything they had been taught. One of the Zero pilots would later write in his diary, recovered after the war, that he thought it was a trick, that the Americans were trying to lure them in, that the other engines were simply idling, waiting to roar back to life once the fighters committed to the attack. Another pilot assumed the bomber was already dead, that it was simply falling with style, and that it would nose over and plunge into Tokyo Bay at any moment. They circled. They watched. They waited for the inevitable crash. It never came. Inside the cockpit, the pilot was no longer thinking. He was reacting. His hands and feet moved in a dance older than language. The body's response to crisis honed by hundreds of hours in the air. The yoke was slick with sweat beneath his gloves. The rudder pedals were pressed to their limits, his left leg shaking with the effort of countering the torque from the single engine. The co-pilot had abandoned his own controls and was instead managing the throttle, the mixture, the supercharger, squeezing every possible ounce of thrust from that one remaining right R-3350. The flight engineer was bypassing fuel from the dead engine's tanks, feeding it to the survivor, while simultaneously monitoring temperature and pressure gauges that were all screaming red. They were flying on pure defiance, and they were still on course. The bombardier, lying prone in the nose, could see Tokyo now. The city spread out beneath them like a map made real, a lattice of streets and canals and wooden buildings that seemed to stretch forever. Smoke from earlier raids still hung in the air, columns of gray and black rising from districts that had been hit the night before. He activated the Norden bomb site, making minute adjustments to account for wind, altitude, and airspeed. The crosshairs settled on the target, a cluster of industrial warehouses near the Sumida River, identified by intelligence as a storage depot for aircraft parts and munitions. The bomb bay doors opened. The aircraft shuddered. Drag increased. The single engine howled. Bombs away. 10,000 pounds of incendiary ordnance fell from the belly of the B-29. The aircraft lurched upward, suddenly lighter, suddenly more responsive. The pilot felt it in his hands, the way the yoke eased, the way the rudder pedals relented. For the first time in an hour, he allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this. Below, the bomb struck. Not scattered, not random, perfectly on target. The warehouses erupted in sequential blooms of fire, each explosion feeding the next until the entire complex was engulfed. Japanese firefighters, already exhausted from battling blazes across the city, would later report that the depot burned for 3 days. The Japanese fighter pilots saw the explosions. They saw the accuracy, and they understood, finally, that they were not witnessing a dying aircraft. They were witnessing something else, something that terrified them more than any weapon. American resolve married to American engineering. One of the Zeros moved to attack. The B-29's gunners, who had been silent throughout the approach, opened fire. The dorsal and tail turrets erupted in synchronized bursts of 50 caliber tracers. The Zero banked away, trailing smoke. The other two fighters did not pursue. They broke off, returning to base, where they would file reports that their superiors would not believe. The B-29 did not make it home. It could not. One engine, no matter how powerful, could not sustain flight across 800 miles of open ocean. The pilot aimed for a stretch of water he hoped was within range of American rescue submarines and destroyers. At 14:23 hours, the landing gear still retracted to reduce drag. He brought the bomber down in a controlled ditching. The impact was brutal. The fuselage buckled. Water flooded the bomb bay and the waist gunner's compartment. But the crew had trained for this. They evacuated in under 90 seconds, deploying life rafts as the B-29 sank beneath the waves. They were in the water for 11 hours. The sun set. The temperature dropped. They huddled together in the rafts, singing songs to keep awake, to keep from slipping into hypothermia. At 37 hours on March 10th, a searchlight cut through the darkness. The destroyer USS Haggard had found them. All 11 men were pulled aboard, alive. The Navy crew asked what had happened. The B-29 pilot, wrapped in a wool blanket, his hands still shaking from exhaustion, told them, "One engine, 3 dead engines. Tokyo, perfect bomb run." The destroyer captain did not believe him. He thought it was shock, delirium, the mind's way of coping with trauma. It was only after the mission reports were filed, after the reconnaissance photographs were developed and analyzed, after the bomb damage assessment confirmed the destruction of the target, that the story was verified. A B-29 had flown on one engine, had bombed Tokyo, had done it perfectly. In the weeks that followed, Japanese intelligence officers interrogated prisoners of war, trying to understand what they had seen. They asked about the B-29's engines, about fail-safes, about redundancies. They could not comprehend how an aircraft that heavy, that large, could remain airborne on a single power plant. The physics did not add up. The engineering made no sense, but it did make sense. It made perfect sense if you understood the American philosophy of design. The B-29 was not built to be elegant. It was built to be redundant, over-engineered. Every system had a backup. Every backup had a backup. The engines were powerful enough that, under the right conditions, with the right pilot, one could carry the load of four. The fuel tanks could cross-feed. The electrical systems could reroute. The flight controls, though hydraulically assisted, could still be muscled manually if needed. The B-29 was designed to survive. And more importantly, it was designed to complete the mission even when survival seemed impossible. To the Japanese, this was not just a technological gap, it was a philosophical one. Their own aircraft, sleek and maneuverable, were built for performance at the edge of limits. There was no room for redundancy, no tolerance for failure. A Zero with a damaged engine was finished. A Betty bomber with a fire in the fuel tank was a flying coffin. Japanese doctrine accepted that some missions would be one way. American doctrine assumed that every mission could be survived. The single Wright R-3350 engine, still screaming at maximum power as the B-29 descended toward the water, became a symbol, not of desperation, but of abundance. The abundance of engineering, the abundance of resources, the abundance of a nation that could afford to overbuild, to overdesign, to ensure that even when everything went wrong, the mission could still succeed. The crew of that B-29 returned to duty 3 weeks later. They flew 19 more missions before the war ended. The pilot was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation mentioned his skill, his composure, his leadership. It did not mention the fear. It did not mention the 11 hours in the water, or the way his hands shook for weeks afterward whenever he touched a throttle. It did not mention the nightmares where he heard the sound of engines failing, one by one, a symphony of mechanical death that always ended the same way. With him alone in the cockpit, the yoke useless in his hands, the ocean rising to meet him. But he flew anyway. They all did. Because that was the other thing the Japanese could not understand. American crews were not fatalists. They did not accept death as an inevitability. They fought against it. They engineered around it. They survived it. And when survival meant flying a 70-ton bomber on one engine across enemy territory through flak and fighters, to drop 10,000 pounds of bombs on a precise target and then ditch in the ocean and wait for rescue, they did that too. 79 years later, in a museum in Ohio, there is a Wright R-3350 engine on display. It is not the one from that flight. That engine rests somewhere on the floor of the Pacific, entombed in the wreckage of a B-29 that gave everything to stay aloft. But it is the same model, the same design. The plaque beside it mentions the engine's specifications: 18 cylinders, twin-row radial configuration, 2,200 horsepower. It mentions reliability, performance, innovation. It does not mention that one of these engines alone once carried 11 men and the weight of a mission across the sky. It does not mention the Japanese pilots who watched, disbelieving, as a bomber that should have been falling instead completed its objective. It does not mention the philosophical chasm that moment represented, the difference between a military that accepted limits and a military that refused them. But perhaps it does not need to, because the engine itself, silent and still behind its velvet rope, tells the story. It is not beautiful. It is not elegant. It is heavy, complex, over-engineered. It is built to do one thing: keep flying no matter what. And on March 9, 1945, 23,000 feet above Tokyo, with 3 of its brothers dead and the weight of history on its cylinders, that is exactly what it did.